An elitist group of leaders of some of the world's most industrialized economies with neither standing nor authority or power to impose or enforce their decisions on the world, or a crucial platform for international economic cooperation that has saved the world from major financial calamity since the 2008 financial crisis. Whatever your views are, the G20 has come a long way and makes decisions that affect us all. We are exactly 75 days away from the G20 Leaders Summit to be held in South Africa. And for the next 3 months, G20 Focus will be your guide and information hub, seeking to break down the complex issues that the G20 is grappling with the help, of course, of leading local and international newsmakers and subject matter specialists. Good evening and welcome to the premiere episode of G20 Focus. I'm Thulasizwe Simelane. Well, there's definitely a sense of hype in South Africa about the G20. But what is the G20? Well, take a look at these numbers. 85% of the world's GDP is generated among G20 countries. G20 countries also account for 60% of the world's trade, and 63% of the world's population lives in G20 countries, including, of course, South Africa. So let's get into this then. My guests this evening are Dr. Philane Mthembu, Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue. We also have Ambassador Xolisa Mabhongo, South Africa's G20 Sous Sherpa, and on our virtual platform we'll be joined by William Carew, who is head of the Secretariat of the AU's Economic, Social and Cultural Council, ECOSOC. But first, let's take a listen to what South Africans, residents and citizens of the host nation have had to say about what they know about what the G20 is and what it does.
So excited, super excited that the G20 is coming here, more especially that we are the hosts. And we hope that with all the leaders that will be converging here, it will bring good results for us, will build strong relationships.
It's about what lasting effect is it going to leave, you know. It's all good when we have people come to our country and we set the stage up. We look good to the world for 2 days, you know. We look clean as if we want change. But what's it going to leave us with afterwards?
We need to develop greater international relations with other countries in terms of trade development, export and import, especially seeing our current situation of America and South Africa with the 30% tariff hikes.
African countries are owing a lot and we are in debt most of the time. So I think it's one of the reasons why we need it, so that they can use as a means to alleviate some of the debt that we are owing. They can even wipe some of them out off.
I haven't heard of this group called G20. It wasn't really communicated to us. I would have really hoped to know more about it, because the youth in our country, we need to find direction, we need some leading, we need more information on how we can progress as a youth in this country.
Do you know about the G20? It's an event that is hosted here in Africa for the first time this year. It's going to be where 20 leaders across the world are going to be gathered to speak about the economy and just to navigate a way forward and how we can make it a better place at South Africa as well as the world.
Yeah, so that's just a sampling of some of the voices of South Africans giving their own perspectives on what the G20 is and what it does. But let's hear it from those at the coalface of preparations for the G20 summit. Good evening and thank you for coming through. Ambassador Mabhongo, let me start with you. What is the G20?
Thank you very much. And firstly, congratulations for this inaugural show that you have started as the SABC. We really appreciate it. We think it will be a vehicle to share information about the G20 to the nation, to the continent of Africa and to the world as a whole. The G20, as you have already indicated in your opening remarks, was created as a group of countries that are very systemically important for the world economy, for world politics. to basically come together and see what is it that can be done, what are the initiatives that we need to do to address some of the challenges that are facing the world today, whether it is the cost of capital, whether it is a debt that is settling many African countries, many developing countries, whether it is climate change, whether it is gender equality and empowerment of women. So all these global challenges require a grouping of this nature. This type of countries, the countries that, as you said in your opening remarks, that account for so much of the world's GDP. But these are countries that also have a responsibility. Remember, if you're talking about climate change, for example, most of the countries that are considered to be major emitters are among the G20 countries. So therefore, these countries have a responsibility to lead the world, to set the direction, to set policies that can address the challenges that we face.
Dr. Philane Mthembu, weigh in on this for me, please. How do we set the G20 apart from, because from what Ambassador Mabhongo is describing, someone sitting at home may be thinking, but isn't that what the United Nations exists for, what the AU exists for, what the EU exists for, and what SADC and others exist for? How do we separate the G20 from those international organizations?
I think it's important to ensure that the agenda within the G20 consistently remains relatively consistent, disciplined, and tries to not necessarily encroach on some of the core functions of the United Nations. Now, of course, given that these countries are amongst the most influential within the world, there are certain topics that are discussed within the UN and other structures that they cannot avoid. So, for instance, peace and security. It may not necessarily be at the core when it comes to why the G20 was created. However, you cannot have economic development, you cannot have a successful reform of the international financial architecture in a world that is increasingly seeing a rise of key conflicts throughout the world. So the G20 is from time to time forced to discuss issues that have an economic impact, but that may from time to time be discussed within the UN and other structures.
Yeah, Mr. Carew, let me bring you into this conversation from the perspective of the African Union, of which ECOSOC is, of course, an advisory body. What's your best explanation for someone who asks you what sets the G20 apart from formalized, structured international organizations that are known, for instance, to have a fully fledged administration as opposed to this being a forum?
Thank you very much. I think it's very important to note that the G20 is widely regarded as the main council for managing global economy, like colleagues, panelists have rightly said. While you look at the United Nations having a broader membership of about 193 countries, it is often too large and politically divided when it comes to making swift economic decisions. And therefore, the G20, like you rightly said in your introduction, representing 85% of global GDP and 75% of international trade, and more significantly, 2/3 of the world population, you will definitely agree with me that it is mostly the most influential economic steering committee in the continent. And therefore, the African Union participation actually gives the continent what I would call a single voice at key global discussion, especially when you look at the geopolitical context and more fundamentally the dynamics where nations and communities are becoming insular and less open to outside influences. So I think looking at it from that multipolar world perspective, several nations are now competing and interacting in various fronts, either at the political level, the economic level, military level, or culturally level. So the context itself provides that reality and dynamics that African priorities such as debt relief, such as climate financing, such as issues related to vaccine infrastructure need to be discussed. And therefore, the African Union coming in provides an opportunity for partnership and more specifically targeted support that's geared towards addressing some of these issues.
Ambassador Mabhongo, maybe let me ask you this question. Why 20? It started out as 20, of course, but now at the last tally, we're talking 21 with the addition of the 2 continental blocks. But who decides which countries have a seat at the table of the G20?
Well, first of all, the admission of the African Union into the G20 is very significant for South Africa, very significant for the African Union itself, but also significant for the world, given the fact that the African Union is actually also at the center of addressing some of the challenges that are facing the rest of the world. So the decision to admit the African Union was by consensus amongst G20 members, but it took some years of lobbying by South Africa. South Africa took a leadership role in ensuring that the African Union, like the European Union, was represented and becomes a full member of the G20.
We'll get to the African Union representation, but I guess I was just asking about, in the introduction, I posed the question that says, is it an elitist group? So who decides that you qualify to be a part of this grouping? What's the criteria?
Well, the criteria is mainly about countries that are globally, that have got an impact both in their regions but also globally in terms of the world economy, and also countries that are systemically important, so that, for example, if a particular country were to fail economically in their region, it would have a bigger impact beyond that country's own borders. So that is basically a general criteria, but there is no strict or rigid criteria that was set that said these are the countries, but it was more about, remember the G20 was founded at the time of the economic crisis where there was a need for a response. So the sense was that these were the countries that would be able to fashion a response for the international community to the economic crisis. But it has, of course, the agenda has expanded over the years to encompass more subjects than just the issues that have got to deal with the economy.
So the result then, Dr. Mthembu, is that it's a diverse grouping of countries, isn't it? In that it's not necessarily countries that are like-minded, that always agree on ideology, geopolitics and the likes and interests, but actually it's diverse from the United States to Russia to China, India, South Africa, and the likes, Brazil and others.
I think that characteristic is a strength. It's a very important characteristic. The reality is that the world is moving into a more diffused power architecture. So we've moved away from an ecosystem where essentially a decision by the United States could be imposed on others, or let's say the United States simply working with European countries. So the G20 represents, I think, an evolving geopolitical landscape where you've got leading countries within the global south that are actively playing a role. The last 4 presidencies have all been held by leading economies from the global south. And it's important to have those differing views when it comes to the reform of the international financial architecture. That in itself should be a strength and should be a representation of the complexity that we see in international relations.
But gentlemen, none of you is answering my question about if we are saying it's not a fully fledged organization. In fact, perhaps we can show some of the crises that the G20 has been crucial in responding to, some of the financial crises that it's been involved in. So there you have it. The Mexican financial crisis, that was very early on, right at the founding, around 1999. This was before the fully fledged heads of state, iteration of the G20. We talk, of course, about the 2008 financial crisis. Mr. Carew, maybe you can come in on this one. How is an organization, well, a formation, a platform, able to act decisively in the light of crises when it's not a fully fledged organization such as the AU, for example, which has a secretariat and other entities such as the one that you head up? What is it that enables the G20 to take decisions such as those that were taken in 2008, as well as during the COVID-19 pandemic? Give me some examples where G20 decision-making has been felt on the ground on the continent.
I think it's very critical, first and foremost, to be able to establish the fact that there are no legal enforcement power. And I think that is what colleagues have been trying to clearly indicate. But it basically relies on political will. It relies on what I would want to say peer pressure and the muscle of its members to deliver.
Yeah.
So the influence, in my view, comes from the agenda setting. The agenda setting is very significant in terms of mobilizing finances through institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and more fundamentally, the reputational pressure to follow through some of these agreed decisions or action based on the agenda setting. So its influence basically derived from the political will and the mutual interest of its members to cooperate. So therefore, this is what I see. It can be a weakness when consensus is normally difficult to achieve, especially on decisive issues. But it is also, like my colleague said, it is its greatest strength, allowing it to have that flexible and candid platform for dialogue to be able to address critical issues that affect the continent. Let me land on this. When we look at the geopolitical realities and the fact that some of the issues that currently affect Africa as a continent, and Africa are not seated in the table where decisions are taken on critical issues that confront or affect Africa, then it becomes a major challenge. But with African Union now and South Africa being on board, then you have an opportunity in terms of partnership to be able to lobby and advocate so that you can be able to make decisions in the best interest of the African people.
All right. Let me pause for a moment. Ambassador Mabhongo, I can tell you are itching to weigh in on this. Let me take your thoughts on it immediately after this short break. In a moment, we focus on the significance of the G20, not only for South Africa, but also for the African continent in its entirety. Do stay with us. This is G20 Focus on SABC News. Welcome back. This is G20 Focus. South Africa's presidency of the G20 and now the upcoming Leaders Summit coincided with choppy seas on the international front, with the foundations of international governance and cooperation being tested to the limit, if not redefined. The country's choice of theme to guide its presidency: solidarity, equality, and sustainability. Noble goals. But how do we even achieve them when challenges that have vexed developing nations, many on the African continent for decades, continue to have a stranglehold on their development? Take the indebtedness of various countries, for example, and the costs they bear when they engage in borrowing, such as bond yields. These are the interest rates that they pay when they borrow by issuing bonds. Take a look at that. There's the picture as it plays itself out. The costs of borrowing borne disproportionately by the African continent, Latin America, Asia, and Oceania. And the more you move into the more advanced economies, such as your United States, the lesser those bond yields are. So that's the reality that we are dealing with as far as that is concerned. So it's also talks to this major shakeup that happened in the G20 in 2023, when the African Union, representing 55 countries on the continent, joined as a member, the second nation bloc to do so, after the European Union, of course. It arguably represented yet another platform for the continent to amplify its voice in the global conversation and drive its developmental agenda and agitate for reform of skewed global governance systems. To gauge sentiment on how effective a platform it's been for this purpose, our team took to the streets of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania to hear from citizens there whether decisions taken at the G20 will have any positive impact on the economies of African countries. Take a look at this.
Most of those countries are in Europe and America, so hosting it here, it's good, but not per se that will make the changes. Somehow I feel like by it being held here in Africa, they might discuss more of the things that affect also Africa. So I hope also my country will benefit from the the decisions that will be made on this meeting.
Currently, there is a globalization, meaning that there is an industrial revolution. Now our country is going up live on mostly in economic development to be an industrial economic country. So we'll take a step toward the development of building so many infrastructures associated with the industries, so that people can benefit more. A lot of movement will be created, and so on. And also, it will be a call for the investors outside the country or all over the world to come and invest in our country.
So the G20, from what I know, is a group of 20 powerful countries coming, and they have a summit. And I believe they've decided to come to South Africa, basically to put together, make policies, and to see how best they could work with other countries in Tanzania, Africa, and all over the world. So hopefully we'll get good exposure. Tanzania is a brilliant place. There's a lot of scope here. The tourism sector is big, it's booming, and we look forward to having more exposure and being on the map.
Yeah, just some of the sentiment then out on the streets of Dar es Salaam that was gathered by our team, just giving you a sampling of some of the thinking about the G20 and its impact. Ambassador Mabhongo, I know that you were itching to weigh in before we took the break. You were itching to come in at the point where you were going to talk about examples where the G20 has been effective in responding to crises.
Yes, I think the most recent example is during the COVID pandemic, where the G20 was able to agree on a debt service suspension initiative, the DSSI. And South Africa, as a member of the G20, was one of the countries that actually advocated for this, to say when you are facing a major catastrophe such as the COVID pandemic, countries must be allowed, must be given room to suspend their payments on debt service. So this is also linked actually to one of the priorities that South Africa has put on the table for the G20, which is debt sustainability. As you know, today many African countries and many countries of the global south actually pay more on debt service costs, as you showed in your diagram, than they do on health and education. So this is not sustainable. There's no societies that can thrive, that can develop without investing in health and education. Right now, we're having a very reverse moment where we are paying more for debt service costs than we do on health and education. So South Africa has placed the issue of the debt sustainability for low-income countries as one of our key priorities. And we're working with other G20 members to generate consensus on this. And I wanted also to touch on what Dr. Mthembu said earlier, that we are having a very unique moment in the sense that we have had the presidencies of the G20 from Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa. The global south. And what we've seen when it comes to setting the agenda, for example, under the presidents of India, the agenda was very set on the reform of the multilateral development banks, the MDBs. That was developed further under Brazil, and we've taken it a step further under our own presidency. So this is also how the G20 works. So as a presidency, we have an opportunity to basically set an agenda that can then be developed over successive presidencies.
Is this the kind of architecture we need, Dr. Mthembu, at a time when I was saying earlier on that the institutions of global governance and even the multilateral system itself is under strain, if not being challenged or perhaps even flipped on its head? Is something that's consensus-driven, where the agenda can be set by one presidency and continued in another presidency, less formal? Does it conduce for driving some of these developmental issues that we are seeking to drive at a time such as this?
I think if we look at the broader multilateral institutions, it's quite clear that there is deadlock. So multilateralism, we could argue, is in crisis. The UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, the Security Council has struggled to resolve key conflicts throughout the world. It struggled to become a proactive actor and a convening actor, for those states that are actually in conflict. And that's been driven by geopolitical tensions. We look at the World Trade Organization. It's really hit a deadlock on key reform initiatives that countries in the global south have been driving. So some of the formalities in institutions like the United Nations, like the World Trade Organization, have actually become a constraint in an environment of geopolitical tensions. So an institution that is less formal, like the G20, that is able to take decisions much faster, disagree on issues where there's disagreement, but certainly find consensus on certain issues. Those countries have it's a force multiplier. They're able to take the initiatives within their countries, within their regions, that eventually have a global impact.
Yeah. Mr. Carew, let me come to you. In terms of alignment between what the G20 is trying to achieve on the global stage, on the host of issues that we've been discussing this evening, how does it align with what the African Union is seeking to do as spelled out in the AU's Agenda 2063, for example?
I think what is more fundamental here is the fact that the African Union is talking about achieving as a continent. And therefore, if we want to achieve a sustainable economic development as a continent, we need to be able to have a common position as African Union. And when we look at the geopolitical realities, especially issues related to the reform of the UN Security Council, the reform of the financial architecture, like my colleagues were talking about, these are areas where we are significantly constrained, especially from the point of Africa not being on the table when some of these critical decisions are taken, and yet still they pertain significantly to the African population. Therefore, having a platform such as the G20, having an opportunity, I think what we are looking at is to be able to have a backed outcome, which will basically look at how we address commitments, such as issues related to the debt crisis that colleagues have been talking about, following up on pledges, and then also be able to demand for accountability through leveraging on this partnership that we have established. So I think it's a win-win situation, in my view, the fact that you can leverage on an informal, less well-structured in terms of this old diplomatic and strong kind of bureaucratic processes in making decisions. So this is something that African Union and the African member states can leverage in terms of unlocking some of the challenges that we are currently confronted with at the multilateral stage.
I hope you all realize just how fascinating you've made the next conversation that we're going to have in the next few minutes about avoiding being eclipsed by geopolitics when we have the leaders meeting. I hope you realize how interesting you've framed that discussion, given what you have said about the effectiveness of the less formal approach of the G20. But before we get there, let's bring in the perspectives of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who has been talking on the issue of global financial institutions and saying that the global governance institutions do not adequately serve or represent developing countries, in particular African states.
In the Pact for the Future, which was adopted at the UN Summit of the Future. And you are critical to bringing that pact to life and helping to lead this process of reform and renewal. How can we do that? First, the G20 must lead on delivering financial justice. As you know well, financing is fundamental, from inclusive economic growth to supporting industrialization and food security or addressing inequalities. The Pact for the Future includes commitments that provide a roadmap to reform global financial institutions. These institutions must represent today's economy, not the world of decades past. And developing countries must be represented fairly in their governance. These institutions must also protect economies, particularly vulnerable ones, from global shocks. It is time to mend and strengthen the global safety net that during the COVID we detected that it was no longer entirely fit for purpose.
All right, so let's bring it back then to the conversation. Dr. Mthembu, perhaps I can start with you on this one. Is this to say there's never disagreement within the G20 countries? Given the diversity that we were outlining earlier on, I imagine that there have been instances where they just couldn't agree and fundamentally disagreed on some issues and approaches on how to respond to issues.
In fact, it's a good point. Let's go back to 2017 when Germany held the presidency of the G20. This coincided with the first Trump administration. And during that time, there were certain passages in the leaders' declaration that the United States opposed, particularly related to commitments around climate change. And in that instance, what Germany did is to acknowledge that the other members of the G20 have agreed on this particular issue. However, the United States chose to not agree. So essentially, yes, there are issues of disagreement. But I think, you know, as long as the majority are driving the organization in a particular direction, then the disagreement of one member does not derail the whole agenda. We might be having to learn some key lessons, obviously, from that 2017 German presidency, because of course we know that there may be certain issues that the United States may be looking to oppose.
Yeah, and in fact, I think one of the other examples I saw, you may know better about it, Ambassador, Argentina disagreeing at the last summit in Rio de Janeiro about a 2% taxation of the rich to fund the sustainable development goals. But what Dr. Mthembu is raising, and the reason I'm smiling is because I was almost leaping out of my chair as you were talking about how to navigate disagreement. That's where you come in, isn't it? I was asked to ask you specifically, what is a Sous Sherpa and what is a Sherpa? What do you do in relation to what Dr. Mthembu was describing?
Well, Sherpas and Sous Sherpas, I mean, our role is really to provide advice to the leaders. So it comes from the Malayan traditions, Himalayan traditions of Sherpas taking people through the mountains. So our role is really to advise the leaders.
Taking people through the mountains, helping them climb. Yes, even when it's difficult.
Yes, so that is basically the role of the Sherpa and the Sous Sherpa. In this context. But I wanted to also come to what Dr. Mthembu said. Really, the G20 is really about building consensus around the key global challenges that are facing the world today and trying to move the world forward progressively in an inspiring way. And as Dr. Mthembu has said, there will be differences, of course. You mentioned Argentina, the US, and others. So there will be differences on certain areas. But the value of this formation is really to continue building the consensus to say the world is facing these big challenges. Hence, our theme is about solidarity, equality, and sustainability. When we envisioned our G20 presidency, we had to sit back and say, what are the big challenges that are facing the world today, and what is it that is common? And we found out that actually focusing on solidarity, on equality, on sustainability is the key driver. Hence, our theme has also been widely welcomed around the world, not just by governments, but also by civil society organizations. So our hope is that in the Johannesburg summit in November, we will have an ambitious outcome. There will be differences inevitably here and there. But in general, our aim is to achieve an ambitious outcome.
All right, you've set it up for me nicely. In the next few minutes, we will be discussing how exactly the host nation, South Africa, and others involved will be able to ensure that, you know, the G20 and its agenda don't play second fiddle to geopolitics that have been playing themselves out over the last while. That conversation coming up in a moment. Welcome back. This is G20 Focus. Part of what the G20 aims to be intentional about is centering the UN Sustainable Development Goals. They do try, each presidency trying to align the UN SDGs with their theme. So there, what you are looking at now, though, is the reality of how a share of global aid has been decreasing for the least developed countries. This is global aid, also including the official development assistance. In the last while, we've been talking about countries pulling back from that, approach to global issues that is founded on international solidarity. Interestingly, solidarity being part of the theme that South Africa is seeking to drive. So let's focus on that then. The ability of the G20 to continue to drive its focus on the Sustainable Development Goals in light of the unfolding realities. Let me pick it up with you, Ambassador Mabhongo. So sustainability, solidarity, equality, sustainability is our focus. How? When the reality stares us in the face that, yes, aid is not the be-all and end-all of solidarity and sustainability, but it is a component thereof. But we are seeing that even that component is on the retreat.
That is why in our G20 presidency, we are also putting a lot of focus and prioritizing the importance of the reform of the multilateral trading system centered around the World Trade Organization. We believe that by reforming the multilateral trading system and the WTO, it will allow countries in the African continent, in the global south, to do more with trade. I fully agree with you that aid is not the be and all, and we are facing the realities that we are facing now where aid is declining. But one of the ways in which developing countries can actually fare better in the world is by doing more trading, and that is the approach that South Africa is taking. Secondly, if you look at some of our priorities, again, if you look, for example, on critical minerals, we've placed the use of critical minerals and beneficiation at source at the center of our presidency. Again, we're saying here that African countries cannot afford to do mining in the same way that we've done for the past 100 years. We need to envision a new approach to mining critical minerals. And these are minerals that are actually vital for the world economy. And in Africa, in the continent, we are a big source of these types of minerals.
Yes.
So generally, if you look at our priorities that we have set through in our presidency, whether it is addressing the issue of the cost of capital, or whether it is addressing the issue of trade, or whether it is addressing critical minerals, they are really about moving our economies upwards and making sure that we really do not depend on aid as the only source of our revenues.
Yeah. Mr. Carew, let me bring you in then. What's your reflection of, the impact South Africa's presidency of the G20 has had broadly for the continent in driving some of these issues around not only relying on aid, but also issues of trade, as well as the new emerging themes of what will drive the economy, the endowment of the African continent, for instance, in critical minerals, but also ensuring that that's beneficiated at source without being, exported as raw commodities.
I think South Africa has played a critical leadership role, and we need to be able to acknowledge that, especially when you look at the rise in geopolitical tension, and more fundamentally the fragmentation, which basically have threatened multilateralism. So I think South Africa has played a critical role. What you will look at in terms of how this has played out, especially in terms of aligning to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we've seen that the whole conversation within the G20 has gone and expanded beyond economics. It now serves as a key forum where we discuss world's most pressing issues. So we are talking about critical minerals, we are talking about climate change and energy transition, we're talking about global health, like my colleagues were talking about, in terms of how do we coordinate pandemic, in terms of preparedness and response. We're talking about digitalization and even taxation, which you also spoke about. We're talking about how we align the sustainable development. And one thing which is very critical is the ability and the conversation around addressing inequality and other social issues, which are now way beyond the whole aspect of economics. And these are critical issues which at the multilateral stage where we have structured institutions, we are finding it difficult to have a breakthrough. And therefore, the role of South Africa playing a leadership role within the G20 and having the African Union coming on board, I think is critical. And this will go a very long way in paving way for conversation regarding the reforms that we are pursuing at the multilateral stage.
Let's pause then for a moment. I know that I've promised you that we'll get to the crux of geopolitics. We'll do that up next. This is G20 Focus on SABC News. So for at least the past 3 years, the G20 meetings have had as a feature global political tensions taking center stage one way or another. The tensions often lead to member states sometimes not agreeing on the final communique, as we've described, the final communique of heads of state and government. There was a glimmer of hope that, this might improve in the last few months at the last meeting of central bank governors and finance ministers. That's the finance track of the G20, when they adopted a declaration. However, the United States of America, the next president of the G20, has not been fully participating in meetings that have been held as part of the preparations. So the US president has now announced that he will not be attending. After all that speculation and sort of toing and froing about that matter, it's now clear that he has now said he will not be attending. Let's take a listen to this clip before we discuss how geopolitics will likely impact the G20 meeting.
I won't be going this year. It's in South Africa. I won't be going. JD will be going, great vice president. And he looks forward to it, but no, I won't be going to that.
We would have preferred that President Trump comes, but I think we could be perfectly happy that the Vice President Vance comes. Certainly as a country, our government is indeed very keen to hand over properly. As you've seen, there's been a lot of work that's been put into this G20 work there, and so what we will hand over to the United States at the end of the year will be a very rich program.
So you heard there from the US President Donald Trump, as well as the reaction of former President Thabo Mbeki in South Africa, saying that it would have been preferable for the President of the United States to have attended so that the handover to the next president is smooth. Dr. Mthembu, let me ask you to lead us in this aspect. Does it detract from the work that has been done during South Africa's presidency that the next president, given how the G20 handles its presidency, the past, the current, and the future president being a part of that transition always, does it detract the fact that it won't be the president of the US attending, but the vice president of the United States?
Look, I think in reality what you have is that the US has now put the matter to rest. It is going to be participating in the summit at the level of the presidency. It could have even juniorized, the delegation that comes to the summit. It could have chosen to simply not come at all. In fact, there were threats of that earlier in the year. And there was a lot of damage control that was done, back channels being followed between South Africa and the US. And I think what South Africa has driven the point is that the US is taking the presidency next year. It's important for the US to be represented at a relatively high a senior level. And I think the fact that they've now confirmed that the vice president will be coming, I think South Africa should look at that in a positive light.
That's an interesting take on it. Yeah.
I think it's a positive thing. So there will be a handover. But I think we must also not forget that throughout the year, the US remains part of the troika of the G20, which has Brazil, South Africa, and the US. So the US, even though they've not been participating in some meetings, they get the briefings, they understand, where the situation is in terms of agreement or disagreement. So they've been part of it, even though there have been tensions along the way.
Ambassador Mabhongo, weigh in. Does it detract from the work that has happened? And importantly, this tradition of the one president setting the agenda and the theme and certain priorities that align on a longer track with what the G20 is trying to achieve, and therefore the next president, perhaps without much being said, actually picking up on that, maybe fashioning it in their own way, redefining it, but pursuing overall the same trajectory. Does the non-attendance of the President of the United States have an impact on that tradition?
No, we do not think it will have an impact. We welcome the attendance by the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance. We think it represents an important aspect of the responsibility that the U.S. has as the next president. And I must also mention that we've been in conversations with the U.S. as a member of the Troika. We've had several meetings with them at the level of the Sherpas to actually talk about the transition to their presidency. So we are happy with their recent announcements, including their announcements of their preparations for next year for hosting the summit of the G20. So we think this is an important moment, the fact that the US has now finally made a determination, and we look forward to working with them between now and November to make sure that the summit in Johannesburg succeeds, but also that we carry on the important agenda of the G20. Remember also the G20 is bigger than the presidency. You know, it is a collective organization of 21 members now, with the AU being a member. So all of us weigh in on the agenda. The presidency does have the prerogative of setting the agenda, but others weigh in. And so we will have an input as South Africa on the presidents of the United States, but others as well will do the same.
All right, let's pause it there for a moment. We'll come back and in fact, we'll reflect on some of the work that has been done. I think it's 15 or thereabouts work streams that have been busy. All these meetings you've been hearing about, it's part of the work that is being described this evening. So maybe we might reflect on how that has gone and how it has set the agenda. This is G20 Focus. I'll be back with more for you in just a moment. Welcome back. It's been a fascinating discussion. Let me pick it up as we draw to a close. With Mr. Carew, let me pick it up with you. Talk to me about what your reflections are about what would make this upcoming Leaders Summit to be successful and cementing all of the work we've been describing that has been happening in the last 12 months or thereabouts of South Africa's presidency. What will mark it as a successful G20 summit?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we need to understand that with the rising geopolitical tension and the shift in power dynamics, some of the issues in terms of participation at what level, these are realities that are abound. But what is more critical in my view, when we look at where Africa is today and some of the call for a new world order, looking at issues related to reform of the financial architecture, reform of the UN Security Council with regards to even Article 109 and the likes, and all the concerns that we are talking about, I think we have a golden opportunity as Africa. One, the fact that it is being hosted in South Africa. Two, that South Africa is playing a leading role. Three, the opportunity that we have that the African Union is now part of the G20 for us to be able to advocate for some of the critical issues that the continent is confronted with. And I think until we're able to have an outcome that is clearly addressing some of these concerns within the African continent at the multilateral stage, that will be a positive outcome in my view. Until Africa able to advocate for some of the critical issues that is affecting them related to debt relief, restructuring of the debt, and all these reforms that we are talking about.
Ambassador Mabhongo, let me give you the final word. I imagine that in your world of diplomacy, being a seasoned diplomat that you are, the work is never done until the meeting actually sits. So I imagine that the upcoming UN General Assembly also provides you an opportunity on the sidelines. Are there meetings and conversations that are likely to continue to smoothen whatever needs to be smoothed out ahead of the meeting in November?
Yes, that is true. That is what we are planning to do. So we will be using the high-level week of the UN General Assembly in New York this month to actually do all those types of conversations that will make our summit succeed in November. Importantly, we will be hosting a foreign ministers meeting of the G20 in New York on the 25th of September.
Yeah.
And we've chosen a theme that links peace and sustainable economic development. So this will be another opportunity to really build consensus around the issues of sustainable economic development, building the nexus between peace and sustainable development. So we will have those conversations. But let me also mention that a very important element of our presidency is the social summit. So we will also be hosting a G20 social summit just before the leaders summit. And here we want to bring civil society engagement groups and make sure that the G20 is as inclusive as possible.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for helping us make sense of what is a global conversation, but that has local impact, happening also locally, and hopefully we'll get to more participation by the local voices representing the African continent as we build up to the G20 Leaders Summit. Thank you for joining us tonight, and join us next week when we dissect issues around global economic reform. What exactly is that and how to achieve it? That's our focus next time here on G20 Focus. Cheers.